Our next speaker is Aaron Annable. He's the acting Consul General and Consul for Foreign Policy and Diplomacy Service with the Consulate General of Canada in Chicago. Prior to his post in Chicago, Aaron served as the Energy Counselor at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C., and prior to that, he had a number of posts within Global Affairs Canada in Ottawa. His focus has included numerous Canada-U.S. energy, environment, and trade policy files. He graduated from McGill University with a bachelor's degree in political science and international relations and is from Montreal, Quebec. Please help me welcome Aaron Annable.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning, folks. Great to see all of you. It's actually great to see everyone in person at this year's Ag Forum after several years of remote or hybrid events. And I think seeing so many agriculture leaders from the Midwest and beyond together is impressive and a testament to the importance of agriculture and ag trade. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional homelands of the Osage and Kaw nations and of numerous other Indigenous tribes throughout history. I recognize that this land remains important to Native Americans as they continue to celebrate their culture and heritage, including the incorporation of traditional teachings and practices into their ways of life. I would also like to thank the Agricultural Business Forum of Kansas City and Agri-Pulse for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Meetings like this are critical for addressing the agricultural challenges and opportunities ahead of us, most of which affect both Canada and the United States. Finally, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you that play a role in producing, processing, and transporting the food that we eat. I think the challenges that you have experienced and overcome in the past couple of years are perhaps lost on a lot of people. And I think in 2022, most of us would be completely lost if we had to do this stuff for ourselves. So thank you. So often I get the question from people I meet in the United States, what is a consulate? Why do you have one? What do you do? I'm based at our Consul General in Chicago, where we represent the Government of Canada's interests in part of the Midwest. We've worked with some of you over the years. Given in our office specifically, we cover Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, and Northwest Indiana. But we're just one of 16 Canadian federal government offices across the United States. And these are in place to continue fostering the binational relationship, facilitating trade and investment, and to promote collaboration between our two countries. Our two countries, of course, work together on a whole range of key issues. This includes border management, foreign policy and security cooperation, bilateral trade, and the ongoing implementation of the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, or USMCA to you folks, environmental protection, and energy security. A recent key development between the two federal governments, this goes back actually to February 2021, where our Prime Minister and your President launched what is called the Roadmap for Renewed U.S.-Canada Partnership. And this lays out an ambitious framework to advance progress in a range of key areas that we share between the two countries. This includes building a greener and more prosperous future, growing our economies and strengthening the middle class, combating the COVID-19 pandemic, creating safer and more equitable and diverse communities, and standing together globally in the face of threats to democracy. In fact, defending democracy is at the heart of our commitment to stand with Ukraine in the face of Russia's illegal war of aggression. So I was really pleased in the morning survey to see that the subject of trade came up really as front and center as the primary topic that most of you are concerned about. It's actually the primary topic I'll be speaking about today, so that works well. Our bilateral trade relationship represents a $1 trillion partnership that sees over $2 billion worth of goods and services crossing our shared border every day. This supports millions of jobs in both countries. And in fact, Canada and the US set new records for mutual cross-border trade in 2021. So for the first time ever, Canada's exports to the United States surpassed $450 billion in 2021. And our imports from the US also approached all-time highs at nearly $300 billion. As it happens, while our economies were busy setting new records for trade, they also both experienced tremendous growth. Canada's economy grew by 4.9% last year. And America's economy grew at a similar rate, its best year since 1984. For us, this is trade at its best. Trade that creates growth and prosperity for both partners, and it's made up of thousands of individual success stories. We are the US's #1 export market. We buy more goods from the US than China, Japan, and the UK combined. And one of these individual success stories that I wanted to highlight, given it's a recent development here in Missouri, British Columbia-based Ostara, which is a fertilizer manufacturer, they broke ground just a few weeks ago on a new fertilizer production facility in St. Louis. Governor Parson actually attended, and so did some of my colleagues. Ostara produces crystal green fertilizer, and this uses nutrient recovery technology that combines phosphorus, nitrogen, and magnesium into pure crystalline granules, producing a much more sustainable fertilizer product. So this is just one example of the thousands and thousands of connections we have across the border right here in this state. So, of course, the breadth of our trade relationship encompasses almost every sector. There is maybe no better example than agriculture. Canada is the #1 agriculture export market for over half of the US states. We are an important partner for US food security. Our exports help US supply chains operate more efficiently and create jobs for US workers, boosting US exports. Our strong relationship has helped both countries become more resilient to the significant challenges we've faced recently. It is remarkable to see that despite a global pandemic, trade in agricultural products between the US and Canada has continued to grow over the past 2 years, increasing from around $15 billion pre-pandemic to $60 billion last year. At the same time, and I think this is really important, this trade is very well balanced and complementary, with Canada buying around $30 billion of your agricultural exports and the US buying around $30 billion in return. We have the products you need, you have the products we need. Our growing seasons and the nature of our production help ensure that Canadians and Americans can enjoy the food they love for much of the year. And of course, all this trade means jobs and economic activity on both sides of the border. Many products that are imported from Canada are further processed here in the US and sold into both markets, like Canadian grains that go into your favorite breakfast cereals and snack bars. This creates jobs for Americans and Canadians. You can count on Canada to continue being a secure and reliable supplier of agricultural products to the United States, which is important more now than it ever has been. Just this morning, I was looking at headlines, and there was a story from the New York Times. I think the headline was, "A year where everything has gone right for Western Canada's farmers." So the numbers we are seeing from harvest this year in 2022, in some cases, are record-breaking, after what, honestly, in 2021 was a very challenging year. So wheat production up 56%, canola up 39%, soybean up 4%, and corn up 6%. So there are some moisture issues in this year's harvest, but overall, it's been a really positive year in Canada. So supply chains, of course, very closely linked to trade and specifically to ag trade. I know some of the challenges that you've experienced here in the US, certainly not immune to those, and we've experienced them in Canada as well. But I think the key to being a reliable partner is to have reliable supply chains. And given the interconnected nature of our trading relationship, it really makes sense for us to work together to address the global and continental challenges we're facing. Our Ministry of Transport continues to actively participate in the Canada-US Supply Chain Working Group, and this is led by our Privy Council office in the White House. And they've identified 8 key areas to focus on tackling the shared supply chain challenges we face. And this includes security and defense, critical minerals, and electric vehicles and batteries, just to name some of them. Internally in Canada, our Minister of Transport has launched a supply chain task force. And just a couple of months ago, the co-chairs of this task force joined him in Washington for roundtable discussion on supply chains with transportation, business, and labor leaders. This task force has been charged with connecting with stakeholders from across the North American supply chain in the coming months to identify solutions regarding recent supply chain pressures as well as more long-standing issues. And ultimately, the findings of this task force will inform a national supply chain strategy that Canada is developing. Canada's 2022 federal budget emphasizes the importance of improving Canada's supply chain infrastructure and commits over $600 million over the next 5 years to support continued investment in transportation infrastructure, including $450 million for a National Trade Corridors Fund. It also includes initiatives to create digital-first solutions with industry to relieve supply chain congestion, which will help our supply chains become more sustainable and efficient. The $15 billion Canada Growth Fund will use a range of financial instruments to support the restructuring of critical supply chains. Canada is also developing a first-of-its-kind critical minerals strategy that leverages investment in transportation infrastructure to bolster and make supply chain linkages to critical sectors which are poised for future growth. Taking a North American approach will be important in tackling supply chain challenges, particularly with respect to competition in maritime shipping and building binational resiliency and redundancy to manage extreme weather events and other crises. And this became really evident last summer when we had some flooding that basically cut off the lower mainland of British Columbia and the Port of Vancouver from the rest of the country. As some of you will know, that the Port of Vancouver is a key strategic port. And at that point, we were extremely grateful for being able to work closely with our U.S. counterparts to be able to divert shipments, a lot of which ended up in Washington State. So that's just one example of how we have to really tackle these problems together. And one specific piece of critical infrastructure that I wanted to highlight here is the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This is a new bridge that will span Detroit and Windsor. It is a bridge that we are paying for completely and handing over to Michigan to operate. We're firmly committed to this bridge, which will ensure direct connectivity with existing highway networks on both sides of the border and will help move goods and travelers quickly and efficiently. Construction has started, and in fact, work on all 4 components of the project, including the Canadian and U.S. ports of entry and the Michigan interchange and the bridge itself, are well underway. The bridge is expected to be in service by the end of 2024. And of course, some of you will be familiar with the Ambassador Bridge. I think the statistic I saw was up to 1/3 of our cross-border trade in goods moves across that bridge. So to have this second bridge built and in place will be invaluable, I think. And we also see the bridge as encouraging new investment between Canada and the U.S. to help create and sustain thousands of jobs and opportunities on both sides of the border. Russia, Ukraine, and agriculture, as we all know, looking globally, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is leading to serious food security challenges around the world, and I would say actually a crisis in Africa. Canada continues to work with our global partners to help restart exports of Ukrainian grain that have been cut off due to Russian blockades of Ukrainian ports. We also continue to support the relief efforts in Ukraine, including through a $25 million allocation to the World Food Program to address food security in the region. Canada is a key player in addressing these global supply chain challenges. And maybe related to that, a few points on potash. Not only is Canada a major grain producer and a top 5 agri-food exporter, we are also the world's single largest producer and exporter of potash. a fertilizer that our farmers rely heavily on. Last year, the US imported over 90% of its potash needs. Canada supplied over 80% of these imports. The Government of Canada recognizes our unique role as a supplier of potash to the United States and we have made significant long-term investments to ensure that this supply continues. This includes a recent agreement to support the development of a new potash mine in Saskatchewan. This is the first new major potash project in Canada in over 50 years. This mine will be at the forefront of sustainability and is expected to generate the lowest direct on-site emissions intensity of any potash mine in North America. This is in line with Canada's approach to tackling climate change and doing so in a way that leverages technology and innovation. So on climate change and climate-smart ag, like their American neighbors, Canadian farmers are amazing stewards of the land and have long cared for the environment. They are on the front lines of climate change and are the first to feel its effects. To adapt to the new climate realities, the Government of Canada is encouraging the adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices and technologies to reduce our emissions and to be leaders in sustainable agriculture. We know that this is what consumers are asking for. A few examples. Our Agriculture Climate Solutions Program is part of a broad $4 billion investment that will help to develop and implement farming practices that will help farmland store carbon and reduce GHG emissions, like shelter bouts or cover crops. Our Agriculture Clean Technology Program is aimed at supporting the adoption of clean technologies, particularly those that meaningfully reduce GHG emissions. And our On-Farm Climate Action Fund will support farmers in adopting beneficial management practices that encourage better nitrogen management, adoption of cover cropping, and rotational grazing practices. And these are just a few of the efforts that the Government of Canada has launched to help farmers continue to be at the forefront of sustainability while also continuing to support efficiency and profitability. Of course, climate, agriculture, and energy all go hand in hand. The US-Canada energy relationship has never been more critical to continental and global energy security. Canadian energy from your closest neighbor and ally is a secure, affordable, available, and sustainably produced resource. Integrated cross-border energy infrastructure plays an essential role in delivering the energy and securing North America's energy supply. In February, Canada's Minister of Natural Resources announced that Canada's energy sector has committed to an increase of 300,000 barrels per day of hydrocarbon production by the end of 2022. Almost all of this will go to the US to support North American and global energy security. Canada's Environmental, Social and Governance, or ESG record for oil production ranks third in the world, well ahead of any other supplier to the US, which itself ranks sixth. Canada is one of the only major suppliers of oil to the US that has a price on carbon and a goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Energy trade with Canada helps both countries transition to a low-carbon economy while enhancing continental energy security. Canada's oil and gas industry matters to Canadians, but it also matters to the US. The US is the destination for virtually all of the Canadian oil that isn't used domestically, with Canada supplying the US with 61% of its oil imports, and this makes up 20% of the US daily consumption. 1 in 5 barrels of oil consumed in the US comes from Canada. US imports more oil from Canada than from all OPEC members combined. Canadian crude oil represents the most of the oil refined in the US, whose products drive the US manufacturing sector and are exported all over the world. This trade moves through over 70 cross-border oil and gas pipelines, creating one of the most integrated energy systems shared between any two countries in the world. Moreover, compared to other methods of transportation, such as rail or truck, pipelines generate significantly less GHG emissions. To continue to deliver and enhance these benefits, we need to build the necessary infrastructure to get these products to where they are needed. Ethanol, something I'm sure that's of interest to a lot of you folks here, and some of you may know this already, but Canada's clean fuel regulation became law in July of this year, is expected to drive up ethanol demand in Canada. The CFR, as we call it, is designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation fuel. It increases incentives for the development and adoption of clean fuels, technologies, and processes. More specifically, the clean fuel regulation will increase demand for low carbon intensity fuels in Canada, including those derived from canola and other agricultural crops. This represents an opportunity for Canadian farmers to diversify their business. For example, the canola sector has identified domestic biofuels opportunities as an important element of market diversification. But I would say at the end of the day, given our current levels of domestic biofuels production, this also represents an opportunity for our largest energy and trade partner. In 2021, Canadian imports of U.S. fuel ethanol increased 8% year over year to 1.3 billion liters. This increase was driven by higher Canadian fuel usage and an increased share of domestic supply going to exports. In 2022, imports of U.S. fuel ethanol are forecast at a record 1.5 billion liters, with further expansion of the fuel pool and an upward trend in the average nationwide blend level. So, looking to the future of ag and international trade. As we look towards our other issues facing the ag sector, including labor shortages, supply chain and shipping challenges, increasing protectionism around the world, it is important that we continue to work together to find opportunities for collaboration. The merits of free trade are well known and include innovation, economies of scale, market competition, and increased access to products, just to name a few. Canada's economic recovery after COVID-19 was aided by its vast network of free trade agreements that cover 61% of the world's GDP in 51 countries and opens doors to 1.5 billion consumers. With tariffs around the world now at near historical lows, there are other commitments that are gaining prominence in free trade agreements. These include reduction of red tape, increasing predictability in regulatory requirements, and commitments to broader goals, such as addressing environmental issues and protecting human rights. Early evidence points to free trade agreements being effective at lowering these trade barriers and the overall costs of trade. And the new iteration of NAFTA, USMCA, or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada, depending on which side of the border you're on, is now the gold standard. NAFTA helped grow the size of and increase the standard of living for the middle class in all three countries. It paved the way for unprecedented economic integration between partners, creating a platform that allows companies from Canada, the US, and Mexico to make things together rather than simply to sell things to each other. The July 2020 USMCA modernized key elements of NAFTA and addressed challenges of a 21st century trade, promoting opportunities for nearly 500 million people who now call North America home. For the ag sector, as part of the overall agreement, Canada agreed to provide new market access to the US in the form of tariff rate quotas for dairy, poultry, and egg products. Canada has agreed to tariff elimination for whey powder, and margarine. And USMCA allows US-grown wheat of varieties registered in Canada to receive an official Canadian grain grade. Our federal agriculture ministry, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, has been happy to see the engagement fostered through the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, particularly the Tri-National Agricultural Accord with Canadian, American, and Mexican ag leaders. Given the fact that trade between these three countries has quadrupled since the establishment of NAFTA, now USMCA, we think that these dialogues are critical. Our nations are working hard to keep our supply chains strong and resilient, to grow our economies and strengthen food security across North America and the world. We look forward to the next NAFTA Tri-National Accord in October in Mexico. And one last thing that, before I close, that I wanted to highlight, and this is actually just literally news from an hour ago for a new Government of Canada announcement. So, as many of you know, since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've imposed certain restrictions at the border related to pandemic levels and trying to keep our population safe. Throughout this long 2 years, we've followed the science and updated various requirements, and I think now recognize that with these new Omicron variants and with vaccine levels and immunity levels in Canada, it was announced this morning that as of October 1st, Canada is removing all remaining border restrictions related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this includes, some of you will have heard of this Government of Canada application called ArriveCan that people had to complete in advance of traveling to Canada. That will now be optional. It will no longer be a requirement. So again, we'll continue to monitor the science on how we manage the pandemic, but I think this is a key development that took place this morning that I thought important to highlight that here. And I would say in closing, cooperation during COVID-19 crisis has shown the strength of our relationship to the world and revealed common concerns related to the manufacturing and procurement of essential supplies. Since the beginning of the pandemic, our countries have closely collaborated to maintain the two-way flow of critical inputs across the border. And we must continue to work together to strengthen our supply chains, address vulnerabilities, and move towards a strong economic recovery, and to keep this massive trade relationship growing. So thank you again. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you about the important bilateral relationship. I am here today with my colleague, Colleen Duke. Feel free to chat with us. If you want to talk to me about dairy tariff rate quotas, hit me up. That's fine. I also have a lot of background in the energy space from my time at the embassy over the last 5 years, and I'm happy to talk about individual energy issues or any other concerns you have. So thank you again. I appreciate you listening.
Hopefully we've got, all right, great. My lav's working. You can stay there with the microphone, and we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So I really want to thank you for that excellent presentation. Give us an update from our friends who we can now go visit a lot more easily, right?
Can.
That's all good. So please take out your phones and send some questions in via Slido. I see we have a couple that are coming already, and as a couple more come in and populate. One question I had for you is, I mean, you're talking about the importance of trade that showed up on our screen. Tell us what Canada is doing to try to break down barriers with other countries and forge new trade agreements right now, because there's somewhat of a perception in this country that, you know, we've done great things on trade in the past, but now we're kind of tinkering around the edges rather than really going after big new trade agreements. Where does Canada stand on either with any country trying to get new trade agreements going right now?
Yeah, so that could be a really long answer. You know, I would say just right out of the gate, I mean, the Canadian economy is highly reliant on international trade. There's no question about that. Going into the USMCA negotiations was interesting. Probably not the normal path that you follow for these sorts of opening up these negotiations, which normally involves preliminary consultations. It was kind of a dramatic announcement that came from your president at the time.
Around Twitter.
Yep. But yeah, I mean, I guess what it forced us to do was to get in gear quickly, and ultimately it did. You know, if you look at when NAFTA was first announced, like, our economies have changed dramatically. So it did present an opportunity to modernize the agreement, and I think the USMCA looks a lot like NAFTA. It preserved a lot of the commitments that we made, including in ag, but allowed us to modernize, and particularly in relation to the digital economy, as well as reducing red tape. Now, as we look further out, of course, we've also successfully completed a trade agreement with the European Union. That was a long, sometimes tough process, but we were very pleased to get that across the finish line. Some of the same issues, dairy, of course, with Europe as well, as you know, but we did get through that. Otherwise, looking further out, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is something that we are very interested in, and we can see a lot of what we've put into the USMCA is perhaps coming out in that agreement. We've got exploratory discussions with India. I think those still have a ways to go. So I think, we will all continue to have our sensitive pressure points. But, I think looking at USMCA as a model, we do have the means to approach these, and we'll continue to try and do so. And as I said earlier, I think environmental protection and labor and human rights will, for us at least, will continue to figure prominently. And of course, it's a priority right now for our federal government to apply a diverse and inclusive agenda across all of our international agreements, as well as advance our feminist foreign policy. So those will be key elements for Canada in any international trade agreement we pursue.
Thanks. So we do have some ethanol advocates in the room, and they're excited to hear about your new policy to encourage and incentivize renewable fuels, canola and other biofuels. What do you see is the market potential for consumption of ethanol in Canada, given that, right now, still not as many people driving as we've had in the past? Do you have some insight you can provide on how that might change with ethanol being blended?
Yeah, and I don't have a specific forecast number, but happy to follow up offline with anyone who and I can probably get you that information. In general, I think we're feeling quite optimistic. So Canada's overall climate change plan, our emissions target now is a 30% reduction by 2030 from 2020 levels. It is extremely ambitious, and it's going to require action across every single sector. And in that regard, I think lower emissions fuels are going to figure prominently. We do have right now, our current national price on carbon is $50 a ton this year, projected to go up to $170 a ton by 2030. And as this price increases, I think the attractiveness of lower emissions fuels is going to grow. And I suspect that our U.S. government colleagues that assist you all in sort of exports in this area are probably well aware of this and can probably also provide you market information in Canada. But yeah, it's an area that we're quite optimistic about growth in, for sure.
So you also mentioned fertilizer,
Yeah.
and one of our participants wants to know if you can address Canada's policy on reducing fertilizer consumption and also trying to maintain productivity on the farm.
Yeah, and so I'll keep this answer really short, and this is something I've seen recently that our agriculture minister has said that our objective here is it's not to reduce the amount of fertilizer. The heart of our objection is to reduce the emissions that are being produced. That is our primary goal. So if we're hoping to be able to incorporate ways to continue to use fertilizer just at a lower emissions profile, and that's our objective at the end of the day.
Okay. In terms of trade and transportation, it's also the home of Kansas City Southern. Do you have any news for us on what's happening with the CP Kansas City Southern merger and how that's being addressed? And there's also a question about, is it Any guidance you can provide on what routes might have to be changed or eliminated?
Sure. So, and I know we're at the heart of the CP-KCS merger right here at where we sit. So, so my understanding that proposed merger is currently going through review with the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. I believe they've just published a draft environmental impact statement. So I think from the federal government perspective, this issue obviously involves Canadian Pacific, but there are concerns coming from Canadian National as well. So these are two very large Canadian railway companies. So I'm not going to get into sort of our position on any of those dynamics. What I would say is, regardless of who the proponent is, I think the idea of a single railroad that is truly linked through all three countries is something that's very interesting. Again, though, I can't really get into commenting on the dynamics between CP and CN. As for East-West, I have not heard those rumors. So yeah, I don't have any updates on that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I know we're throwing a lot of different topics
That's
at you
fine.
here. One of the concerns we usually hear from folks in U.S. agriculture, excuse me, is that the regulatory approval process is never fast enough to bring new innovations to market. And one of our questioners wants to know whether or not you see any changes in the Canadian regulatory approval process for new innovations, whether it's being, biologicals or new products that can help be more climate smart on the farm.
Very possibly. I think that's, yeah, I think some of, well, actually quite a bit of the climate-related legislation that's been implemented is going to obviously require regs to advance that legislation. And I think that would hold true over a range of areas. We still do, this is a long-standing bilateral mechanism is the Canada-U.S. Regulatory Cooperation Council that still, connects annually. And some of the recent activity I've seen from the council is, shifting to more of some of these climate areas that both countries are trying to advance. And, I think at the federal level, our current administrations are very aligned on pursuing not only climate-related initiatives, but climate smart ag. I've certainly watched some of the developments happen in the U.S. So yeah, I do think that there could be regulatory change, but as we are so dependent on trade with the U.S., I think we are constantly watching as we implement new regulations, being mindful that they are not in any negative way impacting the vital cross-border trade that we have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let's join in giving him a round of applause. Thanks. Aaron, thank you.